This is question number 6 on quiz 12 for chapter 24. When the economy suffers a temporary negative supply shock and the monetary policy makers try to stabilize economic activity in the short run, then from this chapter we learn that there are three types of shocks: aggregate supply, aggregate demand, permanent aggregate supply, and temporary aggregate supply shock. In the case of in the first two cases, aggregate demand and permanent aggregate supply shocks, and there's no trade-off between stabilizing inflation and stabilizing the economic activity or employment. But in the case of temporary supply shock, there is a trade-off for the central bank to stabilize inflation versus stabilize the economic activity. And it's better to understand this with a graph, which we can pull out from our lessons. So you can see that from chapter week 11, chapter 24, PowerPoint lecture slides. So we can go to the case of temporary, temporary supply shock. So there are three possible ways that central bank can respond to this type of shock. The first one is no policy response, and the second one is that it can stabilize inflation, but not economic activity, as we just mentioned. And third way is it can stabilize economic activity, but not inflation in the short run. So the question here is talking about try to stabilize economic activity. So we know that this will not stabilize inflation, and it's the temporary negative supply shock. And I believe that's exactly the case we talk about here. So this is a negative supply shock, a temporary supply shock, and the economy moves from 1.1 to 0.2. So inflation goes up and output falls to below the potential level. And because output is lower, so there's excessive snag in the economy, and that can put a downward pressure on the price, hence the inflation. So the expected inflation goes down, that has the potential to drive down the temporary AS curve. So even without policy response, the economy will gradually fall back to the original level. But the point here is that that will take some time, sometimes a very long time, for the economy to fall back to the original point. And during that process, the people will suffer a higher inflation and a long times recession, because output here is lower than the potential level. So what the central bank can do in this case, based on the setup, is try to stabilize the economic activity. By that, we mean they try to stabilize the output. So what they can do is to ease the monetary policy. And we know that when the monetary policy eases, that will affect the AD curve. The AD curve will shift to the right and upward. So, and the new intersection, the intersection between the new AD curve and this AS curve will have a higher output compared with the 0.2 here. So that's how they can stabilize the economic activity. But you can see that when they try to do that, actually the inflation goes even further up. So they cannot stabilize the inflation at the same time. So we can actually, I think based on our discussion so far, we can probably check the answers to see whether we can answer this question. So A, output will be at its potential. So I think the central bank can do that because when it tries to stabilize the economic activity, it can shift the AD curve here. I think that's the case. Exactly is AD3 curve. So this is the new AD curve and this is the AS curve. So when the central bank eases the monetary policy, the AD curve shifts to the AD3. So the number 3 here is the new equilibrium level, and this level comes back to the original potential output, but at higher inflation. So the output will be at its potential, that's correct. But we shouldn't stop here because there's one choice D, all of the above, which means that potentially the other choices can also be correct. So let's continue to check B and C. Aggregate demand curve, B, aggregate demand curve shifts rightward. I think that's also right? Because when the monetary policy is eased, the AD curve will shift to the right. And C, inflation rate will be higher, and that's also right. Yeah, compared with point 0.1 here, 0.3 has a higher inflation rate. So that means D, all of the above is correct, and E is not because C is also correct. So let's check our answer. The input is correct.